Yeah, so I want to talk a bit about this insect biodiversity and pest management and intercropping, but I'd like to take a little bit of a different approach than you usually hear. So I will not talk too much about pest management, or I'll do it here just to like have you a little bit on track. But I like to see insects as these organisms that just live in this ecosystem and that are adapted to this. And I think it's also a bit more useful to think about them in that way to know how they will also respond to intercropping and to different measurements. And in that regard, I will also take a bit more of a community ecology approach, if you might call it that. So I hope you'll enjoy that a little bit. And I think is this one? Oh, you have to. Yeah, that will help if it's turned on. Yeah, so as Lambert already said, kind of like if you do intercropping, you change the plant community, right? So you change crop abundance, because if you before had a monoculture with just one crop, now you have two crops that have to kind of share the space, except maybe when it's an additive design. You change crop diversity. There's more different crops in this field now, and you also change weed diversity in that regard. In this way, like kind of get these big changes in plant communities. And these changes in plant communities will also have an effect on the insect communities, and that can be on one hand on this herbivore abundance, as I said before, which you could also see as kind of pest abundance or these kind of things, and on insect biodiversity. And there's many studies out there that studied this effect of intercropping on pest management or on biodiversity, or on herbivore abundances, all these different things. I just put out 4 meta-analysis here that are relatively recent that showed this, and I could have shown probably many more. And what they're all showing is there's a couple of things that they're kind of showing the same thing. So here, it's a bit difficult to see, I see now, but there's here a little dotted line, and that kind of shows the kind of the border of what effect it is. So if it's to the left of this effect, it means that whatever you're measuring is lower in intercropping, and if it's on the right, then it means that it's higher in intercropping. And what you can see here, so the line is here, I'll just point it because it's too difficult to see. And you see that for almost all intercropping systems, the pest abundance or the herbivore abundance is lower. But for beneficial arthropods, and here the line is here, it's a bit confusing, but there it's higher in intercropping. And beneficial arthropods in this case were both predators, but also decomposers, other insects that actually have a beneficial role for us in agriculture. And you kind of see the same pattern here. So here in this study, you see the herbivores. I think here the line should be somewhere here. So the herbivores lower in intercropping, and predators and parasitoids higher. So that kind of effect is quite clearly there. And then for insect biodiversity, we see kind of the same thing. So here again, the line is a bit difficult to see, but you see more biodiversity in intercropping systems. Again, more pest and disease control in intercropping systems, and the same again for biodiversity in intercropping systems. And I think what I would find really interesting is that even though it's so kind of consistent, there are still cases where we don't see this effect, and there are also studies that kind of show the opposite. And of course, this could be kind of just a statistical thingy that's left, right? Like there's always a chance that it happens to fall to the other side and that you get a study that shows the opposite effect. But I would actually like to go a little bit deeper and also see a bit why that could be the case for some insects, why some insects might respond in a different way. But first I want to go through, so why is it that these herbivores or pests, just whatever you want to call them, what is abundance is lower in intercropping? And there have been many different hypotheses on this. And I just kind of want to go through them, starting with this effect of crop abundance. So in intercropping systems, you usually get a lower abundance of this crop. So as I said, the crop abundance kind of decreases, and you can kind of see it here. So if I would have a monoculture, then it's all kind of cabbage. But now I removed some of the cabbage and I replaced it by weeds. And then you see that there's less left. And related to this crop abundance, there are kind of two hypotheses that are at least seemingly contrasting. And these are, on the one hand, this resource concentration hypothesis, And this hypothesis kind of says that because you have less individuals of a host plant, the insects will actually go to somewhere else where this density or this concentration of the host plant is bigger. So they would go, for example, to a monoculture, right? They make kind of this active decision to go somewhere else. And in this case, the expectation is that specialists are better at choosing these bigger host patches, whereas generalist species are less affected by this effect. They just happen to be there and they can eat multiple things. So yeah, these are these two types of herbivores. Of course, it's a bit of a spectrum, right? Because there's species that really eat just one plant, and there's species that eat loads of plants, and then there's all kinds of in between. But usually we talk about specialists and generalist herbivores, where specialists are ones that are really dependent on one host or like a small group of hosts, usually phylogenetically related species. And they usually have protection of these hosts. They're better adapted to the host defenses. They're just all around better to deal with this one specific host, but they cannot eat from other ones. Whereas these generalist herbivores, they can also eat from alternative host plants. Then to go back to these two hypotheses, there's the second one, and there's this resource dilution hypothesis. And the resource dilution hypothesis kind of posits the opposite, in that what it expects is that if you reduce the number of crop plants that you have, or host plants, then the herbivores will actually cluster on these plants, because these are the only ones that are left in the field. And here I also want to point out kind of another characteristic of these insects that might be important in like explaining which of these two kind of contrasting hypotheses would play out for herbivore, and that's mobility. So in insects, you have highly mobile species, you have low mobile species, and again, it's more of a spectrum, so there's also species, of course, a bit in between. And these highly mobile species, think, for example, of this butterfly that has well-developed wings that can actually fly. They can use a larger scale area to fly around to. They can move away from a bad habitat. They can escape predators easier. Whereas these low mobile species, so for example, this aphid that you see there, in this case, not even a winged aphid, so this one could not even fly. The only thing it could do is drop from a plant and fall down. They're restricted to kind of the initial habitat that they started at, and they can only use a kind of smaller scale habitat. So what it would mean for these two hypotheses is that, well, on the one hand, this mobility kind of favors this concentration hypothesis, because really mobile species can actually fly away and find a better source that can actually find these concentrations of plants. And I have two examples there on the right, and I try to focus a bit on the wings. And here first you see a thrips. The thrips are these really minute insects, really tiny, and they have these kind of feather-shaped wings. But they're actually quite bad flyers, and they mostly use their wings to be transported through the air by the wind, a little bit like plankton is in water. And in that way, they're really dependent on the wind. They cannot really decide where they're going through. And that way, they could also not really make these decisions as well as, for example, a bee could. In this case, it has well-developed wings. It can fly. It could also fly against the wind. It doesn't have to like follow the wind per se. And then another point here is that insects also differ in their capacity to recognize their host plants. And usually, specialists are better at this, but there are also some cases where it's really like types of behaviors that have developed. So here I have two species that are really closely related, the large cabbage white and the small cabbage white, and both of them are specialists on brassica species, so cabbage and related plants. But they have quite different behaviors that facilitate, well, at least for the small cabbage white, to be there in intercropping, whereas the other one's not. And that is that this large cabbage white, it goes around and it looks for these large patches of plants, and then it lays a lot of eggs in one batch. It can even lay up to 100 eggs in one go, and then flies away. So it's really dependent on these larger host patches, whereas P. serape just lays one egg on a plant and then flies off again, flies to a different plant, lays one egg, flies off, flies to a different one. So the Spirus rape is really well developed to find these small plants. So if you do some intercropping method where plants are really closely mixed, the Spirus rape probably would still be able to find the host. It would still be able to find the cabbage because it's really adapted to it. Whereas the Spirus brasse probably would fly by and just look for a bigger patch or for like a bigger group of potential host plants. Then another aspect of intercropping, and this is where kind of this crop diversity and weed diversity come a little bit into place, is that because you have more crops and more different types of weeds, you also start creating a higher habitat heterogeneity. And what I mean with habitat heterogeneity is that there's just more elements in this landscape. There's more different plants that can be as food source, but this also means that there's differences in kind of microclimates and all kinds of stuff that I will discuss in a little bit as well. And I use this picture for that because I kind of like this system. I think in coffee production, it's already a bit more common to also have these shaded coffee plantations. And then if you go from the sun-grown coffee, you kind of see what I mean with habitat heterogeneity. Here it's quite low, it's just one plant. The sun just hits it directly on top. There's not really a differentiation in like the layers on which the sun comes. There's not a differentiation in use of resources. And then when you move up to these more, they call it here bird-friendly coffee production places, and you see there's just a high diversity in potential areas that also insects could be at and that they could make use of. And this habitat heterogeneity really influences foraging efficiency of herbivores, and that way it can really influence how well herbivores can find the plant or make use of the plant that you're growing. So one of them is this physical barrier, which is really, as the name kind of says. So it's like the idea that because you have plants next to this host plant, the insect can just not find it, it cannot really penetrate. And you can imagine that, for example, for this trips that I was talking about, is transported by the wind, it could just be blown into a crop that's not a host of them, and then they're kind of stuck there, right? So that's the way that kind of works. And then there's this effective host apparency, and what you see on this picture is a faba bean in the middle of a wheat field, and this host apparency is more an idea of the findability of a host by insects. And I visualize that a bit here. I always find these this physical barrier effect and this host apparency, they kind of go hand in hand in a way, and sometimes it's difficult to really disentangle which is the effect that happens. But this barrier effect, our hypothesis, what kind of is the idea is that either because there's a physical disturbance, or a visual or chemical barrier, the crop is not found or not reached. And here again, you get this specialist versus generalist effect. So the more specialist the species is, the less it is affected because it could still find it. The more generalist, the more it is affected by it because they're not as adapted to finding this host plant. And I visualize that with these three aphids, and you can imagine this, for example, being a really generalist species. This is a bit in between, and this is really a specialist. So if you have the cabbages there, they're all attracted to it. You can see some volatiles. Many of these cabbages, they excrete these kind of volatiles that go in the air with smells that a lot of insects can smell and know that it's the right host. But then when we start have this mobility effect as well, but I think I discussed it before. So you can imagine that if I start placing, for example, a barrier of wheat in between that kind of covers the cabbage on one side, then the wheat will also create volatiles. It will become a barrier. Wheat can be quite tall. Cabbage is a relatively low crop, so you get a visual disturbance. And then maybe this generalist or more generalist species will not be able to find the cabbage anymore. And then once I start adding more of a different non-host, then this effect just becomes more and more until also this specialist will not be able to find it. That's kind of a bit the idea here. And then another aspect of this is behavioral interference. And with behavioral interference, you can kind of see it a bit as similar as host apparency, but I think it's a bit different in the way that there's many theories that show that this habitat heterogeneity can also affect kind of certain behaviors of insects. And one example that I really liked is this inappropriate landing mechanism, let's say. It is an example that was worked out for Delia radicum, which is the cabbage root fly. And the behavior that it kind of has is that when it finds a host plant, in this case, it's also their hosts are also cabbage or other brassica species. It will first land on the plant that it thinks is a host. It will touch it. It will recognize, yes, I think this is a host. Then it will fly away again and land on the same plant again to touch it again. And it does this a couple of times just to be really certain that it's a host plant. And then after a while, it will walk down and it will lay an egg there if it's convinced that it's really a host plant. But what happened is that in this study, they grew clover next to cabbage. And then when this Delia radicum flies up after it touched the host, it will come down again. And there's a chance that it will actually not land on the cabbage, but it will land on the clover plant. And it will think, well, this is not the host. I'm not going to continue to fly away. And because it makes several of these landings, there's actually quite some chances that it will just, by chance hit this clover plant and then think, okay, this is not for me. So that's what I mean with this behavioral interference, right? So these crops are interfering with this behavior of this insect. Another one that I had to think about is this example with, I'm not sure what the English name is. In Dutch, we call them Afrikaantjes.
Marigolds.
Marigolds, yeah.
Yes. Tagites is right.
Yeah, marigolds or tagites apparently. This is an example that I learned from my granddad. And he said already back in like the garden that I had at home, I would place these marigold next to the crops because it would prevent nematodes, or these little eels, you would call them. So that's and these nematodes, they can also be phytophages. They can eat from the crop plants, but just having those marigolds just kind of repels them. They create these substances in the soil, I think is what they do, and then these nematodes just are repelled by it. And then there's also trap crops, and trap crops work a little bit differently. These are actually attractants, usually for herbivores, and herbivores will go there, but they actually, on these plants, herbivores have a low survival. And this can be either because it's a bad host, this host is not really a good quality for it, or they cannot at all eat from it. They're just attracted by it, by the smells, by this interference of behavior, or because their predators are also affected by this crop and are also attracted to it, and then they get killed by their predators. And there's an important example of this that's already being used a lot in East Africa, especially, and that's this push-pull agriculture. And here they also use this idea of a trap crop and a repellent crop. So as a trap crop, they use these Napier grasses. And the idea here, so I have to go one step back. So the issue here was that in maize production, they often have this corn borer. What's it called again? It's like a stem borer. Yeah, it's a caterpillar that bores into the corn cob, and then you just get big leaf losses. And the way that they thought was, okay, we can use these trap crop and repellent crop as a trap crop to use these Napier grasses. Maize itself is also a grass, and in that way they managed to attract these butterflies to go to this Napier grass, lay eggs there. But this Napier grass actually not a good host. It's kind of tricking a bit the butterfly. It thinks it's a good host, but actually the caterpillars cannot really survive there. And then at the same time, they also had this desmodium that served as a repellent crop. It's kind of the push element to it. And that creates these volatiles that actually the butterflies don't like, and they push them away. So the butterflies are pushed away from the maize into this Napier grass that is actually not a good host. And this Napier grass in the end is then used, I think, mostly as a cattle food in the end.
It's also a legume, right? Is desmodium?
Yeah, I think this desmodium is a legume. Yeah, and there's of course there's more effects of it as well. I think it also helps against this parasitic plant species, wheat species as well, Striga. There's some more effects, but I just wanted to focus a bit on the insects here. So let me get a little bit of a drink. So far, I mostly talked about kind of bottom-up effects that would affect these herbivores on in intercropping. And what I mean with bottom up is that the effect comes from down, from the plant up to the food chain. And what you've seen so far is really these plants interacting either behaviorally or in a different way with the herbivores. The other side of that is top down, and top down is more predators affecting herbivores, or more this, going up from higher in the food chain down. And this habitat heterogeneity that is created in intercropping also has big effects on via top-down control. And that is mostly because it also improves this agroecosystem as a whole. So one way that it improves it is that it creates resource diversity. And resource diversity comes in many different ways. There is, for example, these aphids that are now carrying there. It could be that on the other crop, there's aphids that do not affect kind of your main crop of interest, but that could serve as alternative prey. But what you could also see is this little droplet here, and this little droplet that's called honeydew, and it's a sugar source that is also used a lot by predators. And these aphids, most of the aphids, they use phloem saps from the plants, which are really high in sugars. And for them, it's actually lethal if they were to take all of those sugars in. They actually have to get rid of some of the sugars. So it's kind of a waste product for them, which in turn is then used by a lot of predators. Resource diversity also comes in simply just having other plants that could be eaten. It comes in different preys. It comes in floral resources, pollen and nectar that can be used. But it's not always just food. It's sometimes also other resources like nesting areas or shelter. Then another aspect is that it creates temporal continuity, and I used some pictures from the experiment, well, kind of the experiment that you also visited on Monday, but then the Lelystad trial, so a different location. And this temporal continuity, what I mean with that is that there's always some habitat in the field that you create, because now, as in contrast to a monoculture, that you would just harvest everything and then all of a sudden, boom, all the plants are gone and you create a different habitat. But in, for example, strip cropping, you get these different habitats. And here you see early in the year, there's already some cereal growing. There's nothing in this strip yet, but now the insects can be in the cereals. Then at some point we grew cabbages in there and they start growing. You see that the cereal is a bit bigger. Here, the cabbages are already covering almost the entire soil. So you have this complete soil cover. And then once the cereal get harvested, there's still the cabbages there. And then here, which is difficult to see now, but there's already some green manure sown that could then start growing and it could cover it before the cabbage get harvested. So that's this temporal continuity. And then there is microclimate diversity as well, because what you can also imagine if you have, for example, this stage of the growing season, then the cereal has a different microclimate than the cabbage has. This is much drier. There's direct sunlight coming on the soil. It's hotter. This is already covered in shade. It retains water better. So there's this diversity in microclimates as well that it's created. And then all these effects, they affect, again, this resource availability. And this resource availability would then decrease for specialists and increase for generalists. And why we decrease for specialists is mostly because of this host dependence part, right? There's less of the specific host that the herbivore could use. But for generalists, it's actually quite good, and they can use more resources within a specific time, but also through time because of this temporal continuity. And here I just show some of these resources. So predation is something that would likely increase because of this habitat heterogeneity, because there's just simply more herbivores that can survive in there, more different species. There is floral resources all the way to the right, so plants can also use flowering plants if they happen to be there, if there's weeds or crops that are intercropped that are flower sources. There's this honeydew that I talked about, but there's also certain flowers that have extra floral nectaries, and these specifically I believe are really good for these insect communities and for certain predators, because extra floral nectaries are these kind of structures on plants that secrete nectar, and they do that kind of throughout the growing season, whereas floral nectar is really at the end stage only. So flower or plant has to be flowering to have that resource, but this extra floral nectar is there throughout. And and honeydew kind of in the same way, because these aphids are also constantly kind of there, or they're at least there for a longer stretch of time producing this honeydew. So these two resources might in some cases be even more important as a sugar resource than the floral resources in these intercropping systems, simply because they're more, they're there over like a continuous amount of time. An example here is relay intercropping that really helps this habitat heterogeneity. I already talked a bit about it. This idea that you grow crops that are not growing exactly at the same time. You don't grow both crops. You don't plant them at the same day. No, there's some weeks or maybe even months in between. That's kind of shown in this graph. So if you have, I think in this case it was maize and soybean. The maize is grown earlier in this case, soybean a bit later. There's a certain period where both of the crops are there. That's a period where also insects can start using both of the crops. And then at some point, one of the crops is harvested and they can go to the other one. And what is really important with this relay intercropping is that it can really help with early colonization of predators. So if you you have a crop that has problems with aphids, but you grow a crop next to it that also has aphids at some stage and it's there earlier, then, for example, lady beetle populations can grow on there. This crop gets at some point harvested, but then the lady beetles can move into the field and are already there where they're needed. And I said here also, closely related crop species are risky, and I always feel a bit double about that because I think it could also be a bit of a risky opportunity in a way. But the reason that I put down risky here is that once you have crop species that are similar to each other phylogenetically or they're closely related, they usually also have the same insect communities on them and they have the same potential pests. Why I call it also a risky opportunity is that I also believe a little bit that in some cases it could actually help because they also carry the same specialist predators and they also have the same predator communities. So in that way it could also be a strategy, but I think it's a bit risky. Usually it's not really done. But then another aspect that intercropping really helps for insects is that it helps host alteration. And what I mean with host, and where this kind of goes through is this idea of metamorphosis. And I think most of you will be familiar with a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, right? And a caterpillar being completely different in morphology than this butterfly. And actually most insect species have this metamorphosis. And this metamorphosis is also seen as evolutionary, a really important trait that evolved because it allows, or one of the reasons is that it allows host alteration. So it can be that this caterpillar uses a different host or a different part of the host than the later butterfly does. And that way the younger life stages don't compete with the later life stages. And intercropping can facilitate that because you can imagine that if you have a field like this, and for example, this is a crop that the caterpillar feeds from. If it was only this crop, it would need to move away from that field as a butterfly to a different place where it can actually find flowers. But in this intercropping system, it can help. And now I'm saying it from the perspective of the herbivore, but the same thing also works for a lot of predators. So a lot of predators that eat, and especially, well, predators have that a lot, parasitoids have it even more. They use these herbivores as prey, but they also need some sugar source, and usually they get that from floral resources or these other things that I said before. So they also have this host alteration where their larvae eat something different, or their early stage is something different than the later stages. No, I just said that. Nice. And here I also wanted to show a little bit of my own work, where we also seem to be finding this effect of host alteration affecting being affected by strip cropping. And here we did research to this Dalia radicum, cabbage root fly, the one that I talked about, that flies on the plant and flies away again and comes back and then can be tricked with a bit of clover. And here we actually found, a bit contrary to what we were expecting, that there were more eggs of this fly on the strip cropping treatment, and especially on the strip cropping treatment. You might have seen it on Monday. There's one that has 6 different crops next to each other, and especially there it was higher. And the reason I believe that that's the case is that this adult as a fly, it doesn't eat from the cabbage, but it actually eats floral resources. It eats from flowering plants. It might even eat from extra floral nectaries that were also in there. We had faba bean there that has these extra floral nectaries. So what I believe is happening is that this adult is actually benefiting from intercropping. But then what we did afterwards was also look at, okay, how many of these eggs actually make it into larvae or pupa and to later stages? And then there we didn't see this effect anymore. It became kind of equal, the numbers relatively low anyway of survival. So what I believe is happening is that it helped the herbivores initially, but it also helps the predators. And then how it, in the end, the end result is kind of that the herbivores are still controlled in that situation. And they have served as predator food, which is good for biodiversity. That's an extra effect. Well, I already said before, it's not just food resources that are important and that can be granted in intercropping systems, but there's also these non-food resources. And one of them is this favorable microclimates. You can have both a shady or a sunny crop. You can have a wet or a dry crop, somewhere where it's hot or cold. It helps, it gives protection against bad weather. Because it is microclimate, there might be spaces that actually become less frosty in the winter. Or, well, you see this sad beetle that got trapped in a bubble. That might also be avoided a bit more better in intercropping, where they can move to a better habitat. And it also leads to both overwintering habitats and places where they can develop and do metamorphosis. And as I said, a lot of these insects do metamorphosis, and often a stage, and that is the pupal stage. And this pupal stage is quite vulnerable in a way that it cannot move. It cannot move away from danger. It's just there, sitting there. And if then it becomes really hot or really dry or something, it could dry out. But in this intercropping system, they can actually have a better chance of finding a good place. And here, especially this relay cropping, if that is included in there, and you have kind of a cover throughout, and even a cover throughout the winter with winter cereals or these kind of things, it even becomes better, because then you really create these habitats for them to do their metamorphosis or overwintering. Yeah, and then this also leads to something that Lammert also mentioned already, and that's this resource partitioning and niche complementarity, and that also works on this insect community or animal communities in general. So this higher plant diversity in time and space, it creates better availability of food, more microclimates, and then actually species can partition the resources better. They can make use of different niches. And I use this example of these birds here to kind of show the concept. So you have this beach where you get this gradient of how much water there is that the birds have to go through, and then which birds can actually make use of those resources, even though the resource might be kind of similar. They might all be shellfish, but just because of this water depth, you create these differences. And this resource partitioning for insect communities, it leads also to less competition, more coexistence of species, and because of that, also lower intragill predation. What I mean with intragill predation is predation of predators on other predators, which is kind of negative if you want to have low pest abundances, because then they start eating each other instead of the pest. And if you have, for example, monocles, it could look sort of like this. So you have these aphids, you have a spider and a lacewing larvae, and both the spider and lacewing larvae would eat the aphids. But the spider's actually thinking, well, I can also get this lacewing larvae because it's much bigger, it's a nicer meal. But then once you start having this intercropping system, it creates more kind of nooks and crannies and places that these predators can hide in as well if they want to hide from predators. And then you get that they lower their kind of predation on each other as well. And a really cool example of that is from the early zeros, I think, where they wanted to see also if this lower intragill predation also led to a higher predation efficiency, that there's more aphids being eaten. And what they did here is they grew aphids, was I think a greenhouse study, and they grew aphids either with a ground beetle, with a lady beetle, or with both the ground beetle and lady beetle. And as the name suggests, the ground beetle mostly predates on the ground. The lady beetle is mostly on the foliage. And what they found first was that this ground beetle was then not so efficient eating the aphids because the aphids climb on the plants. They're a bit out of reach for the ground beetle. It would eat some aphids, but not so much. The lady beetle would be a bit better at it because it actually goes to where the aphids are. But what a lot of these aphids do is if they smell danger, they kind of let go. So they just drop to the ground and that way they escape. But if they're there together, well, you can kind of guess it a bit, then they drop to where there's another predator, right? So you get a better control of this herbivore when they're together, and that's why, having many of these predators also creates a higher predation efficiency. And and I think it also comes down a bit to an increase in insect biodiversity, right? Again, this facilitation of host alteration is this resource availability and diversity, more niche. It just creates higher insect biodiversity because there's more place for them. And this higher insect biodiversity in turn leads to more herbivore, but also more predator species and more complex insect communities that are more stable to resist alteration. They're more resilient kind of to disturbances. And one of the things also is that it kind of reduces the chance of species becoming dominant in the system so that they're really the ones making up, taking all of the resources, and it reduces the chance of herbivores outbreaks. And as I said, it changes predation efficiency. So one way it changes predation efficiency I already mentioned is this intragill predation and this better control of predators just because there's more predator species there. And another one I mentioned before is that it changes this host apparency. So herbivores are less able to find their host, but this could also be an effect for the predator. So here again, it sounds a bit like I'm giving a story where it's not all set in stone, but I feel that that's also a bit how these communities work, right? So this host appearance I talked about before with the herbivores, but of course the predators could also be affected by it, right? That if herbivore is hidden among crops, other crops, then the predator might also not be able to find it, which could be a good escape for example, the small cabbage butterfly that I mentioned before that lays one egg on single plants, right? And that way it tries to avoid predators. And then there is kind of a bit of a side note that I also want to give, and I didn't really know where to put this, so I just put it here. But it is also that the success of intercropping, if you want to do intercropping to control a certain insect herbivore, it also really depends on the origin of this herbivore. So some herbivores are endemic. It means that they live in the native range that they have lived in for years and years and years before human times, I think in many cases. And these species have had this long co-evolution with their predators. So there's predators that are well capable of dealing with these herbivores and that have specialized on them. Then there are these invasive species that occur outside of their home ranges. This is often a result of, often introduced by humans via trade or sometimes introductions just by active choice, kind of to there's all these stories where you introduce a certain beetle to get rid of a certain weed, but then the beetle becomes a pest, and then you get a different predator, and then that becomes like this kind of system also happened. And what these invasive species have is that they most of the time escape from their specialist predators. Sometimes they have these generalist predators in their areas, but also often they have lost the ones that are really specialized on this predator. And what might happen in those cases as well is that they start adapting to the situation as well, where some of these predators will also become, for example, more toxic, which is more difficult for generalist predators to get through, which the specialists would be able to deal with. And then there are cosmopolitan species that just occur kind of worldwide, which might originally have also been due to invasions, but mostly these are species that have longer, their invasions happened way longer ago and they have this distributed for a long time. And you can imagine that, for example, endemic species are better controlled with intercropping because you create this favorable habitat for also the specialist herbivores, but these invasive species might be a bit of a more difficult problem in that regard. And then another side note that I wanted to give is that it's not just intercropping that will, especially looking at biodiversity and these communities, it's not just intercropping that will help with bending the curve of biodiversity loss or these kind of things. It really is also other habitats that are needed in this in these systems, especially in these annual cropping systems. Still, at the end of the day, the crop gets harvested. You still have a lot of disturbances. Certain resources are simply not there, and certain species are really adapted to specific habitats. So we also need, well, at least these semi-natural habitats that are often also in agriculture areas. So you can think of beetle banks, which are places that ground beetles like to hide in. It's a bit higher. It's like a little hill. Flower strips, hedgerows, waterways. They're just all other habitats that certain insect species would need. And then on top of that, I also don't really believe that we could ever save all insect biodiversity within agriculture. There's also just a need for really natural habitats, forests or lakes, whatever you name it, other stuff than just agricultural fields. So kind of in conclusion, intercropping often reduces insect abundances, but there are these slight cases where it doesn't, and it's always good to think about it. There's many mechanisms here at play that affect these this insect pressure, and I think it's really important when you research insects within this intercropping setting or just in general. I think it's really important to take this ecology of the insects into account and really think first what is the effect going to be? Where does this insect overwinter? What does it eat? What are their predators before you start thinking on what is actually needed in this intercropping system? And I think lastly, I think it's really important to not forget about these natural non-agricultural habitats. And I kind of as a future perspective a little bit, I just wanted to show a glimpse of what I mentioned before with the slugs. I'm now doing this big research at 22 farms throughout the Netherlands, and I just highlighted a couple of them here. What is really cool is that there's this big change since I started my PhD, as Jocke mentioned, my PhD in entomology, which was already on strip cropping. I worked 3 years on the field that you visited on Monday. And then I started this postdoc on strip cropping, and I was thinking, okay, I'm a bit bored with that field for another 2 years, and I wanted to challenge myself a little bit more. But what also happened in the meantime, I started in 2019 with my PhD, and at that time there were only a handful of strip cropping fields in the Netherlands. It was mostly experimental fields and a couple of partners that we worked together with. But in the meantime, especially Dirk van Apeldoorn, he was there also on Monday, right? Yeah, he didn't sit still, and he talked to a lot of farmers, and he got a lot of farmers convinced to also just try it out and try the strip cropping. And now there is already, I think, around 100 strip cropping fields in the Netherlands, Netherlands. And we just wanted to make use of all the strip cropping fields that are there and really seeing, learning more about the nuances of these findings that we have, because now we had it in this experimental, really controlled settings. But farmers will also have their own views of what helps and what works in intercropping. How wide should these strips be? How many crops can they include? What kind of crops are included? Some of these farmers also do these semi-natural habitats within their strips. They might have flower strips or something else. This one, for example, is a really good example. This is, I think, one of my favorite farms to visit. It's in the west of Brabant. And this farmer even has this little bend in his strip cropping. And it's all covered by forest, like in the middle of the forest. And if you're there, you really feel, it's a bit difficult to explain, but let's say this strip cropping field is also in, as you can see, in forest, but it's different in this one. When I was here, I really felt, okay, there's a forest, and then at some point the forest stops and agricultural field begins, and it's still separated in a way. And here there's really like this, it feels like a transition. You're like in the forest and you transition slowly into agriculture instead of bam, you're in agriculture kind of, which I found just really cool. I just love being in this place just because of how nice and diverse it is. This one is also cool. I'll start rambling a lot, but I think this is my almost last slide. But these guys, they make soy sauce, and they actually grow within strip cropping all the crops that they need for the soy sauce. So they think they have barley, wheat, and soybeans, and they just grow them in strips, and then they harvest them and they use them in their own soy sauce that they make. I think that's cool. So that a bit about what I'm doing now. And then this project, I'm again looking at insects from kind of like this pest management herbivore abundance, point of view. We're also looking at insect biodiversity. What can strip cropping do for that? We're looking at weed abundances. We're looking at yield in strip cropping and crop quality. So a lot of different things. And then I come to the end of my presentation. Happy to answer any questions. And also, I had one little question that I just put up there. If there were no questions, if you're all too satisfied with all the information to still think of questions, then I have one for you that you can try to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much.